the original Kane Lynch is remembered for anything, it's for getting Jeff Gerstmann fired. He gave the game a 6 out of 10 in his review for GameSpot at the time, but then publisher Eidos had a marketing deal with GameSpot to promote the game. The poor review jeopardised the deal, so high-level management at GameSpot fired Gerstmann to appease the high-level management at Eidos, with, it should be noted, neither GameSpot's editorial team or developer IO Interactive's involvement. 6 out of 10 isn't a particularly unfair score for Kane Lynch, mind you. By all standard metrics, it's a pretty mediocre game with some major flaws. Despite a small cult following since its release, the sequel also received equally poor reviews. But reviews only tend to account for extant metrics, and good is not synonymous with interesting. I don't consider myself a reviewer. I'm not too concerned with whether or not a game is worth its price as a consumer product. I'm more interested in them as artistic works, and the Kane Lynch games are artistically interesting in their own way, so we're going to be having a look at both of them today. It was actually something of a surprise that 2007's Kane Lynch Dead Men turned out to be such a mediocre third-person shooter. Developer IO Interactive were previously responsible for the popular stealth action Hitman series, which had released its fourth installment, Blood Money, just the year before, as well as the less well-known but very well-received 2003 third-person shooter Freedom Fighters. Despite the studio's previous experience releasing well-received games, when Kane Lynch launched, it was an incredibly middling third-person shooter, without a whole lot to differentiate it at first glance. Even the shooting, the core mechanic, is pretty underwhelming. Guns are highly inaccurate and lack impact against the slightly too spongy enemies. The context-sensitive cover mechanics were clunky and imprecise. In fact, the entire game feels somewhat unresponsive. Reloading, for example, can't be done manually. You automatically reload when your magazine is empty, or when you haven't fired in a while, often leading to you being in the middle of a reload animation at annoying times. The squad mechanic is also disappointing. The game can be played in co-op, but even with a second player taking control of Lynch, you will have other squad mates with you, but giving them orders never feels particularly useful. They can revive you when you get downed, but can't revive each other, and their general competence leads to it feeling more like you're babysitting them, far more than it feeling like you're a cohesive team. Finally, it's pretty buggy. My personal favourite bug was when a cop car clipped through the van during an escape sequence, knocking Lynch down into a down state that I couldn't revive him from until the van stopped, at which point he was revived merged with the van and couldn't move at all. Even after the next checkpoint loaded him in, he did so without any guns, so he just followed me around like a confused dog for the rest of the mission. But there's also a bevy of other minor bugs. Not properly coming out of a down state, so I could only walk and couldn't interact with anything, shoot, or be shot, that persisted through checkpoint loads, so I had to restart the level, or numerous times the AI teammates wouldn't be able to work out where you were during a down state, or even just standing and staring at you as you bleed out, instead of helping. It's certainly not the worst game I've played, but it's not hard to see why Kane Lynch got such middling reviews, especially given other third-person shooters releasing around the same time, with Gears of War releasing the year before and Uncharted coming out the same month. But in a lot of ways, it's still clear that the game is trying something interesting, even if it's falling short. Dead Men is clearly inspired by the crime films of Michael Mann, with a specific focus on 1995's Heat. Heat has become quite an influential film overall, with many games using it as inspiration to some degree or another. In fact, any game set in the modern day featuring a heist is likely to draw from Heat to some degree, such as the Payday series or Grand Theft Auto V's heist missions. But Kane Lynch is specifically focused on trying to adapt the feeling of one of these films in its totality to the medium of games, with mixed results. Kane takes the role of the player character in single player or the player 1 slot in co-op. Estranged from his wife and daughter, he's on death row for non-specific crimes when Lynch breaks him out of the prison transport they're both in along with a squad of masked mercenaries. Lynch is working for the Seven, a group of mercenaries Kane used to be a part of who want him to collect something they think he stole from them. Oh, and they've kidnapped his wife and daughter to make sure he does it. Lynch is sent along to keep an eye on things and report back, with the promise of joining the Seven if they're successful. Kane and Lynch make for a fundamentally unlikable duo. To be fair, this is genre appropriate. Crime films tend to be pretty heavily focused on men, and those men tend to be placed pretty firmly within the more toxic aspects of masculinity. Violent, short-tempered, and abusive attitudes with the attempted justification that they're doing it all for other people, and all this harm they're causing is totally not a choice to further their own selfish goals. The problem is that while in films unlikable characters don't negatively impact the overall quality of the viewing experience, the closer relationship between player and character within games makes it far harder to engage with them when you're placed in the shoes of a character you don't like and can't relate to. This isn't a problem exclusive to Kane Lynch. Grand Theft Auto 5 had a similar problem for me. Michael and Trevor from that game share a lot of similarities with Kane Lynch. Kane and Michael are both career criminals with an attempt at professionalism, whose criminal activities have harmed their relationships with their family. Meanwhile, Lynch and Trevor are both dangerous and unstable psychopaths, prone to lashing out at civilians at a moment's notice. The difference between the two sets of characters is that Kane and Lynch aren't buried under several layers of irony and gameplay loops to prioritise player fun. They're all irredeemable pieces of shit, but with Michael and Trevor, you're supposed to just ignore that and focus on having a shooty bang-bang fun time, while Kane and Lynch are never meant to be related to in the same way. I was always lukewarm on Grand Theft Auto 5 because despite the gameplay being solid and the world detailed, and well realised, I never enjoyed embodying those characters, but with Kane and Lynch it doesn't feel like I was supposed to in the first place, so the sense of dissonance isn't as pronounced. Lynch's psychopathic tendencies are handled in a quite interesting way, surprisingly. His appearance and violent actions seem to be based heavily on Kevin Gage's character from Heat, Waingro. Lynch suffers from psychotic blackouts, where he goes into a violent rage. He's actually quite distressed by it, which is a surprisingly humanising touch, and the moments when he comes out of it and realises what he's done can come across with some sympathy. Not a lot of sympathy, mind you, he still killed a bunch of unarmed people, but it's unexpected to have someone of this archetype show regret for their actions. Sometimes these events happen as part of a cutscene, but at other times they happen during gameplay. This is fine in single player, but it causes a problem in co-op when the second player is controlling him. During these sequences, Lynch's player will see all civilians replaced with armed police, sometimes sporting animal heads, enough to make it clear something's going wrong, but not enough to help differentiate between legitimate threats and hostages. It's a clever, if slightly grisly way of ensuring the story beat of Lynch going mad and killing a bunch of hostages without provocation still happens, regardless of if there's a player controlling him or not. Lynch's motivation mostly stems from wanting to join the Seven, though he is obviously betrayed by them at the game's midpoint and joins Kane's quest for revenge instead. Kane, on the other hand, is acting to protect his family. He hasn't seen his wife and daughter in around 14 years, but the Seven have them, so he needs to retrieve the 2 briefcases they want to get them set free. The treatment of women in crime films is often pretty poor, and it's no different here. Women often have very little agency when it comes to crime narratives, and will usually either take on the role of a trophy or a burden. One way or another, they only exist as an accessory to the men who make up the focus of the narrative, either as something to be acquired as a reward for all their crimes, or as someone to nag and complain at them about how dangerous things are. Depicted as ungrateful for the life these men provide them through their hard sacrifices, despite it being the men who made all the choices and chose crime in the first place. That's when they aren't getting fridged, of course. Women in fridges refers to the trope of women being killed or hurt as motivation or plot and character development for the men they are accessories to. The term was coined by writer Gail Simone after becoming tired of the trend and references a comic in which Green Lantern returns home to find his girlfriend brutally murdered and stuffed into a refrigerator, hence the name. The trope of course predates this and stretches far beyond the comic space. Around the midpoint of the game, Kane's wife gets about 2 lines of dialogue to tell Kane what a piece of shit he is, and then is immediately shot in the head. Lynch's wife doesn't fare much better, though she doesn't actually appear in the game. She was killed sometime before the events depicted, though details of her death are deliberately unclear. Lynch insists she was murdered, seemingly by one of the Seven, though another character claims Lynch killed her himself. Lynch admits that he was blacked out during the time, but insists that he is certain he didn't kill her himself. The plot point is basically thrown in during the back half to maintain a sense that Lynch can't be trusted after he stops working for the Seven, but again, it's another case of a woman being killed to help develop the man she's attached to. The death of Kane's wife happens alongside Lynch being betrayed by the Seven, so the duo take this opportunity to kill their captors to stop Kane's daughter meeting the same fate. After sending her away, the two set out to round up a group of others who have reason to fight the Seven, the titular Dead Men, then setting out to kill the Seven before they can find Kane's daughter again. Throughout your rampage, you fight your way through several set pieces across several countries, starting it in LA, where you escape the prison transport and perform a bank heist for the first briefcase, then to Tokyo to try and find the second briefcase, back to the US for your betrayal and a prison break to recruit the other dead men, back to Tokyo to actually get the second briefcase this time, before heading to Cuba and finally Venezuela to face down the remains of the Seven. The US sections of the game are fine, but the Tokyo levels contain some of the best bits of the game. Specifically, a fight through the streets on your second visit. After fighting your way down a skyscraper, you emerge into a busy street with police roadblocks set up to apprehend you. There's a running firefight, taking cover behind cars, hunkering down with your squad to clear a path before moving on. You fight your way along the street and across through a bus terminal before reaching your escape van. It's the best bit of the game and the section most reminiscent of the famous running firefight in Heat, and it's one of the better sequences inspired by that scene I've seen in games. It's the best the game does of really evoking the feeling of the film and other films like it, really capturing the rhythm of the action sequences that inspired it. The other notable set piece in Tokyo is during its first visit, but it's a bit more prickly. It's a nightclub scene. The sequence itself, from a purely gameplay perspective, is good. Having kidnapped the owner, you make your way back through the busy dance floor as security hunts you. The floor is still packed with customers, a genuinely impressive number of NPCs for the time, and the loud music and lasers make the scene quite disorienting. Armed with only a pistol, you need to spot and take out the guards searching for you with flashlights before they get the drop on you. It's tense, exciting, and chaotic when fights break out, only let down by the fact that after finishing it, you immediately have to go through the same sequence again, though this time with the floors empty and the music off. Again, from a purely mechanical perspective, it is a genuinely engaging sequence. The disorienting nature of nightclubs do make for good gameplay. Unfortunately, I can't play nightclub sequences in action games anymore without thinking of the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting. For those mercifully unaware, it was a mass shooting in which 49 people were killed and even more injured in a targeted attack against a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. It's, to date, the second most deadly mass shooting in the US, perpetrated by a single gunman. The exact chaotic mass of lights, music and bodies that makes the sequences like this one in Kane Lynch exciting are exactly the same things that led to the deadliness of the shooting in Pulse, and I can't play or see action sequences in nightclubs without thinking about it anymore. To its credit, Kane Lynch did come out 9 years before it, but the association is still there. It seems strange that such a tragic event should line up so closely with something played for entertainment. I'll grant that it is a good sequence, but it still feels like these kinds of things shouldn't be fun. The latter parts of the game certainly aren't fun. Cuba is another prickly sequence. There's an attempted coup happening, perpetrated by the Seven, and you fight with the military to oust them from the Capitol building. There's no real attempt to engage with the country as a place or with its political history, just the vague sense that Cuba's a place where revolutions happen, so dissidents are easy to stoke into revolt. There is of course a history of the US attempting to, let's say, influence political proceedings in the country, but Kane Lynch doesn't really consider the narrative implications of a mercenary group managing to take over the Capitol building, or really set up any kind of ideology for either side. It's just a backdrop on which to up the ante to fighting a military rather than a police force. Despite Cuba being a more unique setting than either the US or Tokyo, the military angle makes the entire sequence feel far more generic than anything that came before it, which is saying something. The Venezuela sequences that follow have a similar problem, but with the added negative of a number of easily failable stealth sequences. Sneaking through the jungles can be kind of a pain, and it feels like the developers got bored of creating a game inspired by crime films and switched to a Vietnam film instead. Reaching the Seven's fortified compound in the centre of the jungle reveals that Kane's daughter has been captured by them again. The twist is that she doesn't seem upset about it. In fact, she's absolutely pissed at Kane for causing all this in the first place, which is fair, though it's also slightly flawed given she seems to be siding with the people she saw shoot her mother in the head just a few days before. Some of this anger relates to Kane's history with the Seven. The contents of the briefcases they wanted from him is never actually revealed, which is probably a nod to Pulp Fiction, but it's clearly stated that Kane got his hands on them after abandoning the rest of the Seven during a job that went wrong. Kane insists there was nothing he could do to save them, the Seven insist that he betrayed them and left them to burn while making off with the briefcases. It's never revealed which is true, but it ties into the two possible endings. After killing the last of the Seven and rescuing Kane's daughter, you're given a choice. You can bundle her into a helicopter and escape, or you can go help the rest of your men in a nearby village. They're pinned down in a burning church, a deliberate parallel to Kane's past with the Seven. Choosing to save the men seems to be the intended ending, given that it leads to an additional level, but neither ending is particularly good. If you leave, Kane's a traitor and a coward, and his daughter hates him for abandoning his men. If you go to rescue them, the only one left alive ditches you to escape on his own, and Kane's daughter gets shot. Rejecting violence and abandoning your men, or embracing violence to save them, neither ending paints Kane in a particularly positive light, though that's probably a good call. Trying to make Kane a hero at this point is a fool's errand. The sequel never clearly indicates which ending is canon, which I appreciate, and there's enough changes that neither actually fits that well. Dead Men reviewed poorly and didn't sell much better. Rights to publishing were transferred to Square Enix when they acquired Eidos in 2009, and in 2021, the game was delisted from Steam, citing that Square were working on some important updates, though it's yet to return at time of writing. Whether it will return is unknown. The game isn't without its merits, though it's certainly no misunderstood masterpiece. Overall, it's a pretty mediocre shooter that's little more than a curiosity. It has its strengths, some genuinely engaging sequences, but they're spread pretty thin on an already short runtime, though perhaps its short length is more of a mercy than anything. While at times it manages to do a good job of mimicking the style and aesthetic of the films that inspired it, it's hampered by its unpolished gameplay, and more so by the simple fact that the films that inspired it don't translate to games as well as it might seem at first. While action sequences are easy enough to reimagine in the new medium, playing as these unlikable characters just doesn't work, and the whole adaptation ends up feeling kind of unpleasant. So how do you go about fixing that? Trying to make the characters more generally likeable would create dissonance with the actions they take, and changing those actions would fundamentally shift the genre away from crime. It's a difficult problem to crack. It seems IO Interactive took a different route. Instead of trying to make the game less unpleasant, they decided to double down. While Dead Men was a globe-trotting adventure with shadowy mercenary groups capable of overthrowing small countries, 2010's Kane Lynch 2 Dog Days is a much more pared-down affair. The action takes place entirely within Shanghai. After the events of the first game, Lynch has set up there, still working as a criminal, but he's built something of a life for himself. Lynch invites Kane to town to introduce him to one of his contacts, a man organising a shipment of arms to Africa. Things go wrong well before the deal goes down, of course, leaving the duo to fight their way across Shanghai to try and escape. Shanghai makes for a great backdrop to the game. There's a few main streets here and there, but most of the game takes place in back alleys and open markets. From a gameplay perspective, it makes for a serviceable series of arenas and corridors to fight through, but aesthetically, a great deal of care has gone into making the space feel detailed and lived in. Alleys are filled with refuse, markets stacked high with produce. The depiction of Asian cities tends towards being high-tech and futuristic, but Dog Days' approach is enamoured with the lower areas of the city, the tech slums of the forgotten and working poor, while great neon-lit skyscrapers in the distance tower over the cramped back alleys and side streets. There is a tendency to associate grit with realism, which is a stance I don't subscribe to personally. The back alleys of Dog Days are no more realistic than the sleek depictions of such cities in other media. Reality is always a more complex mix of such things, but its focus on these areas fits the mood and tone of the game well. There is one problem that Shanghai as a setting introduces, however. Through your flight across the city, you get into a lot of gunfights with both criminals, cops, and even the military, often amongst civilian-filled streets. This is no different from the first game, and I'm not going to claim that the game is somehow racist because all of the enemies are Chinese. That's simply the nature of the setting, and the devs have clearly shown no bias in choosing their settings. The problem comes from the narrative inclusion of the cops and military. While in Dead Men you fought cops because you were doing a lot of things that would draw the cops' attention, in Dog Days it's strongly implied that most of the cops you fight, and certainly the military, are all corrupt, themselves in the pocket of a corrupt politician as the primary antagonist of the game. The topic of corruption within the Chinese political system is of course far more complex than I'm able to get into here, but its general depiction that all Chinese politicians are corrupt is an obvious stereotype, and the idea that the police and military are all in on it is an unnecessary inclusion. You get up to plenty of actions that would warrant a police response, and there's little reason that the primary antagonist couldn't have been a less divisive gang leader, or even if he had remained a politician, he could have been sending mercenaries, or the gangs he's involved with after the player. Instead, painting such a wide swath of the enemies in the game as corrupt members of the Chinese state gives the game an unnecessary sense of exoticism, by giving into stereotypes that the game had almost avoided with its rather sympathetic depiction of Shanghai as a city. The grit and grime of Shanghai's backstreets, juxtaposed against its bright lights and neon signs, work especially well with the game's boldest aesthetic choice. The entire game is framed as if it was shot through a digital camera, and not a particularly good one. The camera shakes while moving, accelerating to a violent lurching when you sprint. Bright lights create massive lens flares and light bars on the screen. The lens fisheyes the field of view slightly, and compression muddies the screen, especially under gunfire. It's worth noting that these effects are not diegetic. Despite the camera falling to the ground as if dropped when you die, no one is actually holding the camera. This isn't a Super Mario 64 situation where Lakitu is carrying the camera. Here it's just an aesthetic, though that doesn't detract from its effectiveness. The dilapidated environments combined with these effects give the entire game the feeling of a guerrilla street documentary shot on a dogshit camera. It is genuinely quite unpleasant to look at when there's so much going on, but at the same time, the quieter moments can be quite striking. There's a certain beauty to the game at times evocative of photography and video taken by urban explorers. I find photography of abandoned or forgotten places rarely seen or rarely noticed by the public, quite fascinating, and when it's not drowned out by the cacophony of gunfire, the game can imitate that rather well. This contrast between quiet moments and sudden barrages of sound and visual effects when a gunfight breaks out were actually well established in the game's initial cinematic reveal trailer, repurposed as its intro cutscene. The trailer shifts between Kane on a job, presumably somewhere in the US, and footage of Lynch at home in Shanghai, the night before Kane arrives. He struggles to sleep, checks his meds, has a chat with his partner. It's quiet and peaceful. Meanwhile, Kane's sequences are loud, uncomfortably so, and hard to make out any specifics of what's going on. The smash cuts between the two sequences are disorienting. The game as a whole manages similar shifts and is very good on the disorienting side of things, though I wish it had dedicated more time to the quieter moments. Unfortunately, as an action shooter, most of the time is spent on the chaos instead. Gameplay has seen improvements since the first game. The automatic reloading and cover mechanics are replaced with dedicated buttons for each, giving you much clearer control. Overall, it plays a lot smoother, enemy health feels more balanced and guns feel more accurate, though still far less so than similar games. Despite being an improvement overall, however, gameplay is rather unsatisfying, which is actually one of the strongest features of the game. A lot of words have been spent, and likely will continue to be spent, on the topic of video games and violence, most commonly by people who don't understand either topic. The truth is that in most cases, violence and certainly gore in video games is highly unrealistic. The two things each serve different purposes. Violence is simply a function of mechanical expedience. It's a quick and easy way of fostering engagement in players. Gore, on the other hand, is a little more complex. People talk often about wanting realism, but when it comes to gore, unrealistic depictions tend to be far more satisfying. This satisfaction comes from a pretty basic human instinct. We love a clear and obvious reaction to our actions. It's why people love clicky keyboards, popping bubble wrap, and people's heads exploding dramatically when you shoot them. The more exaggerated the result of our actions, the more impact they feel like they had, and the more satisfying they become. I happen to be writing this script less than a week after the shooting of Charlie Kirk. Now, Charlie Kirk was a racist, sexist, homophobe, transphobe, and somehow both a Zionist and an anti-Semite at the same time. It is a tragedy that the political climate in the US has degraded to such a degree that people are resorting to violence such as this. Though I struggle to muster a great deal of sympathy for Kirk himself, given how instrumental he was in degrading that climate in the first place. In a pretty repugnant turn of events, detailed footage of his death was widely circulated on social media. If you are lucky enough to have avoided seeing it, I would urge you not to seek it out. You don't need to see it. You will gain nothing from seeing it. It does, however, reveal a truth about the reality of violence. In video games, violence is exaggerated, bombastic, fun. Meanwhile, the reality of violence depicted in the videos of Charlie Kirk are quiet, understated, and truly horrific to behold. Real-world violence is deeply unpleasant to be a part of, whether you are watching, experiencing, or inflicting it. Video game violence is so totally detached from this reality that it bears almost no resemblance to it, but Kane Lynch 2 resembles real-world violence in at least one way, that it is unpleasant to be a part of. Shooting people in Kane Lynch 2 doesn't feel good. Gunfights are devoid of satisfaction. The game is not fun, which is fitting since it is very much depicting events that probably shouldn't be fun in the first place. In fact, the game goes out of its way to make its violence unsatisfying and unpleasant. Beyond the gunfights being a discordant mess of visual effects and loud gunfire, enemy reactions to being shot are decidedly understated. Gore is minimised, death animations are dampened. In fact, the most devastating effects of your actions are denied to the player entirely. A headshot from a powerful weapon doesn't reward you with an exploding head as another game might, but rather pixelates the NPC's injury instead. And your most powerful weapons cause such an aggressive excess of muzzle flash and distortion that you can't make out what you're hitting at all. It does not feel good to commit violence in Kane Lynch 2, which makes it closer to real-world violence than most video games come to depicting. In fact, the most excessive gore depicted in the game is at the expense of the player. Kane and Lynch are captured and tortured but escape. What follows is a mission played entirely in the nude. The duo's sweaty, out-of-shape bodies covered in still bleeding lacerations, with only their genitals mercifully censored by pixelation. It is, like much of the game, deeply unpleasant to be a part of. Lots of games since Dog Days have ruminated on the nature of video game violence by trying to make it unpleasant in some way, most noticeably Spec Ops The Line and The Last of Us Part 2. Those games, however, goaded players into committing acts of violence, then prompted you to self-reflection by criticising that act. Both are great games, but the fact Kane Lynch 2 can achieve a similar feeling without explicitly prompting the player is unique. Of course, this won't be true of all players. It's gained something of a cult following in the years since its release due to this read of the game, but naturally a game presenting itself as a shooter and then being deeply unsatisfying to play and deeply unpleasant to engage with led to its original panning by both critics and audiences. While the gameplay is far more unpleasant than the last time around, the characters have actually mellowed out a bit. Not a lot, mind you, they're still a pair of violent criminals, but progress has been made. Kane is de-emphasised this time around. He wants the weapons deal to go through, claiming it's one last job to get the money together before retiring to try and fix things up with his daughter, who survived the previous game. Lynch, on the other hand, is much calmer than last time. Lynch takes up the player 1 slot this time around, being the primary focus in single player. He's still working with criminals, still committing violence regularly, but he's settled down. His medication seems to be managing the worst of the psychosis he displayed in the first game, though he still mutters to himself during the more intense gunfights. Shanghai is his home now. He has a partner there and a life. He's anxious to see Kane, treating him more like an old friend than someone he once went on a murder spree with. He wants to introduce him to his partner over dinner, that sort of thing. That said, his partner Sue isn't treated much better than the women from the first game. In fact, it's still got the same attitude towards women that the first game did. Kane's daughter is referenced but never seen. The inciting incident of the game is Kane and Lynch accidentally shooting the corrupt politician's daughter while trying to chase down a local criminal that happened to be sleeping her, and Sue features in one mission where you have to protect her from the gang that's after you before she gets brutally murdered off screen in the next mission. Another woman fridged. To quickly nitpick, her name is pronounced Sue throughout the game, but unless my understanding of Pinyin is flawed, which, to be clear, it may well be, I think, based on how it's written in subtitles, it should be pronounced closer to Shu. I don't know if this is a deliberate commentary on Lynch's inability to properly integrate into Shanghai, how he doesn't actually fit in, or if it's just an oversight by the dev team. I'm inclined to lean towards it being a deliberate choice. Dog Days is anything but subtle most of the time, but it has its moments. The most noticeable comes towards the end. A lot of people criticise the final mission for being pointlessly tacked on the end, given that the game is already very short, but I disagree. After being captured by the politician and managing to escape, fighting your way through his skyscraper to find him, he tries to make a deal with the duo. Kane is receptive, but Lynch, true to his nature, executes him on the spot as a revenge for Sue's death. The last mission takes place at an airport, very reminiscent of the ending of Heat, a nice nod to the films that inspired the series in the first place. But it's notable that in single player, control switches back to Kane just for this last mission. Switching the point of view character is a common narrative device across mediums, but in games it's usually used for a pretty basic reason: to tell all parts of a story, or to make sure the player is always where the most exciting stuff is happening. But it can be done for more narratively complex reasons, like it is in something like The Last of Us games. Here, Dog Days does something similar. You control Lynch all through the game. It's his home you're fighting through, it's his life being destroyed by his own pursuit of violence, but once he takes revenge for Sue, his last connection to Shanghai is severed. His story, and Dog Days is primarily his story, in the same way Dead Men was primarily Kane's, is over. Everything he worked for between games has gone up in flames, and he's back to where he was at the end of the last game. So control switches back to Kane. The pair had a different dynamic throughout much of the game, but by the end it's reverted to where it was in the previous game, and so does the player's control. It's a surprisingly subtle addition to find at the end of the game, and that's ultimately what I find fascinating about the game overall. Off the bat, it plays and feels much like any other mediocre shooter. Worse, it's actively unpleasant to play due to the aggressive visual effects, but as you get deeper, all the decisions that seem to make the game bad were clearly deliberate decisions to achieve a certain vision. The game is ugly because it is an ugly thing you're doing. The game feels unsatisfying because violence is not meant to satisfy. A game that was widely panned for being badly designed because it wasn't fun, upon closer inspection is revealed to be well designed because it was never trying to be fun in the first place. There's far more care and effort put into both games than it first appears, but even more so with the second, and it can't really be judged by any standard metrics of quality. as a consumer product to be played for fun, Kane Lynch 2 fails at almost every metric you can measure it by. But as an artistic work, Dog Days represents a genuinely unique experience that went underappreciated at its release. In the wake of games similarly preoccupied with the nature of violence, and not considering fun to be the defining factor of a game, Kane Lynch 2 has started to receive more recognition, and I think it deserves that. I really hope more games in future can treat themselves not as simple products to be played, but as something more, even if with that it requires a little more effort to engage with them fully. Thanks for watching.
Lynch, I need you to calm down.
Go fuck yourself, Kane! Fuck off home! That's what you want! They killed Sue!
Look, I'm sorry, okay? We can get out of here.
They ain't gonna fucking get away with this.
Yes, they are.